The storm hit the city like something personal. By 9 o'clock on a Thursday night in October, the streets of downtown Manhattan had been emptied by sheets of cold rain that came in sideways and stung exposed skin like broken glass. Thunder rolled across the Hudson in long, low waves, rattling the windows of the glass towers that lined the avenue. In weather like this, even the unhoused men who usually clustered near the heating vents of the Caldwell building had retreated somewhere deeper and darker. The streets were abandoned. Almost. Julian Vance did not notice her at first. He had been in meetings since 7 in the morning, and his mind was still partially occupied by the acquisition he was closing in Singapore, a real estate portfolio worth $900 million that had taken 11 months of negotiation to bring to the table. His driver, Marcus, had pulled the Rolls-Royce Phantom to the curb outside the building's private entrance while Julian finished a call, and it was only after he ended it and stepped out into the rain, ducking beneath the umbrella Marcus held out for him, that he heard it. A sound beneath the car. It was small, barely audible over the rain. A wet, hiccuping kind of sound. The sound of someone trying very hard not to cry and failing. Julian paused with one hand on the open door of the car. He looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes betrayed something. Concern, perhaps, or discomfort at what they might find. Julian crouched down. The girl was curled beneath the chassis of the Phantom with her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around a stuffed bear that had lost one of its glass eyes. She was perhaps 8 years old, though she was so thin she looked younger. Her coat, if it could be called that, a threadbare thing with a broken zipper that didn't close properly, was soaked through. Her shoes were mismatched. One pink sneaker with a Velcro strap, one brown loafer 2 sizes too large, both caked with mud. Her dark hair was plastered flat against her forehead. Her lips had taken on a faint bluish tinge from the cold. She was staring at Julian with enormous eyes the color of winter frost, pale gray, wide, and filled with the particular kind of fear that belongs only to children who have been very badly hurt by adults. Not the fear of the unknown, the fear of the known. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain drummed against the undercarriage of the car. A bolt of lightning lit the street white. "Are you hurt?" Julian asked. His voice came out lower and quieter than he intended. The girl's chin trembled. She shook her head slightly, a tiny, automatic movement. The kind of no that had been trained into someone by the knowledge that admitting need was dangerous. "What's your name?" She hesitated for so long that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, barely above the sound of the rain, "Elara. Elara." He repeated it as though testing it. "How long have you been under there?" She pressed her lips together. Another tiny shrug. She didn't know. Time, Julian understood, was not something a child crouching under a car in a rainstorm had been keeping careful track of. He studied her face. There was a bruise along her left cheekbone, faded to a sickly yellow-green at the edges, which meant it was several days old. There was a newer mark at the corner of her mouth, thin, precise, the kind of mark left by something narrow and rigid. A belt, perhaps, or a wooden spoon. Something moved in Julian Vance's chest. It was a sensation he did not have a name for, because he had not felt it in a very long time. Not since he was 7 years old himself, sleeping in a doorway on West 34th Street, with a plastic grocery bag over his feet to keep the cold out. "Nobody is coming for me," Elara said suddenly, as though she had been building up to it. Her voice was very flat. Not self-pitying, just factual. The most heartbreaking kind of statement. "Nobody wants me." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Julian Vance, who had sat across the table from heads of state and corporate sharks and never once flinched, felt something crack open behind his sternum. "I do," he said. He held out his hand. She stared at it for a very long moment. This enormous, dry hand belonging to a man in a soaking wet custom suit who was crouching in the rain beside a car that cost more than most people's houses. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to be very cautious about trusting anything good, she reached out and took it. Julian lifted her out from under the car. She weighed almost nothing. He stood, holding her against his chest, and her small frozen hands curled into the lapel of his jacket with a grip that was desperate and terrified and somehow trusting all at once. And the stuffed bear was pressed between them. "Marcus," Julian said, "take us home." The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Vance Tower, and it had been designed by an architect whose name appeared in museums. It was the kind of place that appeared in architectural magazines as a symbol of what extraordinary wealth could create. Soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering sprawl of the city, furniture that was simultaneously beautiful and cold, artwork chosen for investment value rather than warmth. It was a magnificent space that had never, in the 5 years Julian had lived there, felt like a home. Alara stood in the center of the vast living room and stared. She had stopped trembling on the ride up, not because she was warm, Julian suspected, but because she had simply run out of the energy required for trembling. She held her one eye bare with both arms and looked at the space around her with an expression that was impossible to read. Not wonder, exactly, and not fear. Something in between. The careful observation of someone who had learned to assess every new environment for its potential dangers before allowing herself to feel anything else. Mrs. Aldrich, Julian called. His housekeeper appeared from the kitchen corridor within 30 seconds. Eleanor Aldridge was 63 years old, had worked for Julian for 8 years, and had seen enough to not be easily rattled. But when she came around the corner and saw the small, soaking, bruised child standing in the middle of the marble floor, she stopped walking and pressed one hand over her mouth. "She needs a bath," Julian said, "and food." And he paused, looking at Alara, realizing he had no idea what an 8-year-old girl ate, or what size clothes she wore, or what she might need. The realization produced something unfamiliar and uncomfortable in his chest. Helplessness. Whatever else she needs. Mrs. Aldridge recovered herself with professional speed. She crossed to Alara and crouched to eye level with the kind of practiced ease that told Alara immediately, some animal part of her recognizing safety, that this woman was not going to hurt her. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "My name is Eleanor. Would you like a warm bath? I have bubble soap that smells like lavender." Alara looked at Julian first, as though seeking permission. It was another trained behavior that made something twist in his gut. He gave a small nod. She went. Julian poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and stood at the window watching the rain and trying to decide what he was doing. He was not an impulsive man. He was the opposite of an impulsive man. Every decision he made was measured, calculated, and informed by data and precedent. But the data and precedent that governed his professional life had absolutely nothing useful to offer the situation of a frozen, terrified 8-year-old who had been crouching under his car. He was still standing at the window 20 minutes later when Mrs. Aldridge appeared in the doorway. Her face had changed. In the 8 years she had worked for him, Eleanor Aldridge had maintained an expression of composed and cheerful professionalism through every variety of crisis. He had never seen her look like this, drawn, pale, her eyes red at the rims. "Mr. Vance," she said quietly, "you should come." He followed her down the hall to the guest bathroom. Alara was sitting on the closed lid of the toilet wrapped in an enormous white bathrobe, her hair damp and combed, eating crackers from a small plate with the focused concentration of someone who had been very hungry for a very long time. She looked up when Julian came in, and for a fraction of a second her shoulders rose toward her ears, an involuntary flinch, before they settled back down. Mrs. Aldridge pressed a folded piece of paper into Julian's hand. On it, she had written a list. He read it. His hand tightened on the paper until his knuckles went white. The list was a record of what she had found when she helped Alara undress. A healing burn on the inside of her left forearm, roughly circular, consistent with a cigarette. 3 parallel welts across her lower back in varying stages of healing. Bruising across both shins and her left shoulder. A partially healed cut on the back of her right hand, closed with what appeared to be medical tape that someone had applied at home rather than taking her to a doctor. Julian stood very still for a very long moment. "Alara," he said. His voice was quiet and even, and it cost him something to keep it that way. "Who did this to you?" She looked at her crackers. Her small hands went still. "You're not in trouble," Mrs. Aldridge said quickly, gently. "No one is going to be angry at you." "My uncle," Alara said finally. Barely a whisper. "And Aunt B. Do you have a last name?" "Sterling." The name connected with something in Julian's memory, a property deal several years ago. Sterling Holdings. He would look into it later. "Okay," he said. He pulled over the small vanity stool and sat on it. bringing himself down to her eye level, and it occurred to him distantly that it was possibly the most undignified position he had occupied in 15 years. He didn't care. You are safe here. Do you understand me? Nobody is going to hurt you in this apartment. She looked at him with those winter gray eyes, and the question in them was heartbreaking. How do I know? He didn't have an answer for that. Not yet, but he intended to get one. He left Alara in Mrs. Aldridge's capable hands and went to his office, where he sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, one to his head of security, one to his personal physician, and one to his assistant, instructing her to find him the most relentless, most effective children's rights attorney in the state of New York by 8 o'clock the next morning. He looked at the name that came back to him 40 minutes later, Clara Hayes, Hayes and Associates, previously of the Manhattan District Attorney's Child Advocacy Unit. He called the number at midnight. She picked up on the 3rd ring, which told him something. Ms. Hayes, he said, my name is Julian Vance. I have a situation that requires your immediate attention. There was a brief pause. Mr. Vance, she said, and her voice was clear and alert, not groggy, which told him something else. It's midnight. I'm aware of that. Will you hear me out? Another pause, shorter this time. Talk. Clara Hayes had learned, in 4 years of children's rights law, to be deeply skeptical of wealthy men who called themselves advocates for vulnerable children. In her experience, they came in 2 varieties, those who wanted the PR benefit, and those who wanted to feel morally superior without doing any of the actual work. She had shown up at the Vance Tower the following morning prepared for either, with a legal pad, a recording app running discreetly on her phone, and a professionally maintained expression that gave nothing away. What she had not been prepared for was Alara. The little girl was sitting at the kitchen island when Clara arrived, wearing an oversized sweater that came to her knees, clearly borrowed from someone's emergency wardrobe, a woman's perhaps, or purchased quickly from somewhere nearby, and eating scrambled eggs with the same intensely focused concentration Clara had seen in children who had learned that meals were not guaranteed. She was beautiful in a way that had been worn down almost to nothing, like a river stone, the potential of beauty still visible beneath the thin, watchful face and the shadows under her eyes. She looked up when Clara came in. Hi, Clara said. She resisted the professional instinct to crouch and speak in the high, coaxing voice some people used with children, which Alara would immediately recognize as condescending. I'm Clara. I'm a lawyer. What's a lawyer? Alara asked, with the disarming directness of children who have stopped performing polite social ignorance. Someone who uses rules to protect people, Clara said. Alara considered this. What rules? The law, which is a big book of rules that everyone is supposed to follow, including your uncle. Something moved across Alara's face, quick, complicated, and then carefully smoothed away. She looked back down at her eggs. Julian appeared from the corridor. In the daylight, and in his own home, Clara had expected him to look like what he was, a man performing concern for the sake of an audience. What she found instead was a man who looked like he had not slept, whose suit was immaculate because he had clearly changed, but whose eyes were reddened and whose jaw carried the tension of someone who had spent several hours being furious and doing nothing with it. He held a mug of coffee in one hand and a legal folder in the other. Ms. Hayes, he said. Mr. Vance. They looked at each other with the mutual assessment of 2 people who were both, in their respective fields, accustomed to being the most capable person in the room. He gestured toward the study. She followed. He laid out the folder on his desk. Inside, Dr. Hargrove's medical report from the previous night, which documented every injury with clinical precision, along with photographs. Clara had seen abuse documentation many times in her career. She had developed the professional skill of reading it without her face changing. But the photograph of the cigarette burn on Alara's arm made her set the page down for a moment and look at the window. Silas Thorne, Julian said, and his wife Beatrice. I've had my people pull what they can. Silas was a business partner of Alara's father, David Sterling, before David died. The Sterling estate, primarily a significant portfolio of commercial real estate and a trust fund in Alara's name, passed to a court-appointed guardian when both her parents died in a car accident approximately 8 months ago. Silas successfully petitioned for guardianship on the grounds of being Alara's closest living relative. The estate is in trust until Alara turns 21. And Silas is spending the trust money, Clara said. It wasn't a question. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. What do you want from me, Mr. Vance? He met her eyes. His were dark brown, and she noticed, professional habit, reading people, that they were not the eyes of a man performing emotion. They were the eyes of a man feeling it and not knowing what to do with it. I want to get Alara out of that man's legal custody permanently, he said. I want to pursue adoption. I want every charge that can be brought against Silas and Beatrice Thorne to be brought. And I want the trust fund protected. Adoption. Clara looked at him carefully. You're unmarried. No dependents. You've known this child for approximately 12 hours. Correct. Family court judges are not going to look at a single 34-year-old CEO who met a child last night and think excellent candidate for sole adoptive parent. I'm aware of that, which is why I need an attorney who can make them think so anyway. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Outside the study door, she could faintly hear Mrs. Aldridge talking to Alara in a low, cheerful voice, and the small, careful sound of Alara's reply. My rate is $400 an hour, Clara said. That's fine. I'll need full access to your financial records, your background, and your cooperation with a home study. Also fine. And Mr. Vance, she held his gaze. If at any point I determine that this is not in Alara's best interest, I will say so, regardless of what you're paying me. He looked at her steadily. I wouldn't want it any other way. She believed him. She was somewhat surprised to find that she believed him. Then we have a deal, she said. They went back to the kitchen, and Julian sat down beside Alara at the island. He refilled her orange juice without being asked, and she looked at the refilled glass with an expression that broke Clara's professional composure slightly. Not gratitude, exactly, but the quiet, stunned recognition of someone who was not yet used to small kindnesses being offered without a price attached. Alara, Julian said, Clara is going to help us, okay? She's going to help make sure you're safe. Alara looked at Clara. Then she looked at Julian. Then back at Clara. Both of you, both of us, Clara confirmed. For the first time, the faintest shadow of something that might become a smile moved across Alara's face. The call came on the second day. Silas Thorne had filed a missing person report. Clara saw it on the news before she saw the official filing. Silas had moved fast, calling a press conference outside the Thorne residence in Greenwich with Beatrice at his side, both of them in tastefully somber clothing, Silas's face arranged in an expression of anguished worry that might have convinced anyone who didn't know what Clara now knew. We are desperate for any information about our niece, Silas said, his voice cracking on cue. He was a large man, florid and well-dressed, with the particular confidence of someone who had spent decades being given the benefit of the doubt based on the way he filled out a suit. Alara is everything to us. She is all we have left of our beloved brother David and his wonderful wife. We are asking anyone who has seen her. Clara turned off the television. She called Julian. He's playing the grieving uncle. We need to move carefully. If we produce Alara too soon, before we have enough evidence, the court may return her to his custody as the legal guardian. What do you need? Julian's voice was flat and controlled. Time. And records. She paused. Also, I want to meet him. Clara, I know what I'm doing. She drove to Greenwich that afternoon and rang the doorbell of a colonial revival house that was large and presentable but not extravagant. The house of a man performing prosperity rather than actually possessing it. Beatrice opened the door. Up close, she was a handsome woman in an aggressively curated way. Immaculate hair, heavy foundation, the specific kind of thinness that came not from health but from controlled deprivation. Her eyes were small and sharp, and they moved over Clara with swift, dismissive assessment. Mrs. Thorne, my name is Clara Hayes. I'm an attorney. I have some information about Alara. She was inside the house in less than 10 seconds. Silas joined them in the sitting room, and Clara watched the micro-expressions on his face. Relief, calculation, caution, cycling beneath the performance of a worried guardian. Where is she? He demanded. Alara is safe, Clara said carefully. She's currently in the care of whom? Silas cut across her. His voice had lost some of the television polish. She is my ward, my legal responsibility. I want her back in this house immediately. He leaned forward. If someone has taken her, that's kidnapping. I will call the police right now. Alara has injuries consistent with repeated physical abuse, Clara said, keeping her voice level, watching his face. Medical documentation already exists. Something moved in Silas's eyes. Not guilt. Nothing so human as guilt. Calculation. Children get hurt, he said. She's a clumsy little thing. Always falling down. His tone was almost casual, the ease of a man who had explained this before. I'm sure whatever injuries you're describing have a perfectly innocent explanation. A cigarette burn, Clara said, does not have a perfectly innocent explanation. The room went very quiet. Beatrice looked at her hands. Silas looked at Clara with eyes that had gone cold and steady. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he said softly. I have a very good lawyer. I have friends at the courthouse. And I have legal guardianship of that child. Bring her home, Ms. Hayes, or I will have you disbarred. Clara stood, gathered her bag, and gave him a smile that was entirely professional. I'd actually enjoy seeing you try, she said. Goodbye, Mr. Thorne. She drove back to Manhattan in the rain, and for the first 40 minutes, she held herself together with the practiced composure of a woman who did not fall apart in the car. Then she stopped at a red light, looked at the photographs on her phone from Dr. Harbrough's report, and sat there for several seconds with her hands tight on the steering wheel. Then the light changed, and she drove on. That night, a thunderstorm came up the coast. It was a loud one, with lightning that strobed the windows of the penthouse in rapid, startling bursts. Clara heard about it afterward from Mrs. Aldrich, how Alara, who had been asleep since 9, woke screaming at the first crack of thunder, and how Julian, who had been in his study working, had arrived at her bedroom door in less than 30 seconds. She woke from the nightmare to find Julian sitting on the edge of her bed, not touching her, reading, as Mrs. Aldrich described it, the situation correctly, the instinct of someone who understood that physical contact from a near stranger in the dark could easily be frightening. Just sitting there, a solid and quiet presence, with the bedside lamp on. You're safe, he said, when her breathing had slowed. It's just rain. I know, Alara said, her voice very small. I'm sorry. You don't need to be sorry. A long silence. Lightning again. Alara flinched and then stiffened, embarrassed by the flinch. Julian set down the book he brought. Do you want to know something? He said. I used to be scared of thunderstorms too. She looked at him with cautious skepticism. You? Me. He was quiet for a moment. When I was about your age, maybe a little younger, I used to sleep in a parking garage on West 34th Street. There was a woman named Rosa who sometimes slept there too, and when it stormed she used to tell me that thunder was just the sky moving furniture around. Alara stared at him. You slept in a parking garage? For about 2 years. He said it simply, without drama or self-pity, in the way that people speak of facts they have long since made peace with. I didn't have a family. I didn't have a house. I had a grocery bag and a jacket that didn't zip all the way. How did you? She stopped. Looked at the room around them, the soft lamp, the beautiful ceiling, the silk duvet she was sitting in the middle of. A man named Arthur Hesse, Julian said. He ran a youth shelter on 42nd Street. He found me one night and told me I didn't have to sleep outside. I didn't believe him for a long time. He paused. Sometimes people tell you something good is true and you don't believe it because you've learned that good things don't stay. Alara was very still. But sometimes, Julian said, they do. She lay back down eventually, and he stayed until the thunder moved off east and the rain quieted to a murmur, and by then she was asleep, one small hand loosely holding the edge of his sleeve. He sat there in the quiet for a while longer than was strictly necessary, looking at her face, the way the tension left it in sleep, the way she looked, finally, like what she was, a child who deserved to be safe. The legal and financial dismantling of Silas Thorne was a two-front operation, and it began quietly on a Monday morning 10 days after Alara had been found under the car. Clara worked the law. She had subpoenaed Alara's medical records, not just from the past 8 months of the Thornes' guardianship, but from before her parents' deaths, to establish a before and after picture that would speak to a judge with unmistakable clarity. The pre-guardianship records showed a healthy, well-nourished child with a single broken wrist, age 6, consistent with a playground fall. The post-guardianship records were another story, for emergency room visits in 8 months, each attributed to a different domestic accident, each treated and released, the ER notes reflecting the attending physician's documented but unpursued concerns. She requested the Sterling estate financial records through the probate court, a process Silas's attorney immediately attempted to block, which told Clara everything she needed to know about what those records contained. She hired a forensic accountant named Gerald Park, who had previously worked for the SEC and had a talent for finding money that people had tried very hard to hide. Within 72 hours, Gerald had traced 3 significant transfers from Alara's trust fund to accounts controlled by a shell company incorporated in Delaware that shared a registered agent with 2 other companies whose ultimate beneficial owner was Silas Thorne. He's been taking approximately $40,000 a month, Gerald told Clara in a phone call, his voice carrying the professionally restrained excitement of a man who loved finding exactly what he'd been looking for. I can trace at least $480,000 in unauthorized distributions over the 12 months since guardianship was established. Can you document the chain of transfers clearly enough for a courtroom? Ms. Hayes, I could explain this chain to a jury in 20 minutes using a chart on a whiteboard. Perfect, Clara said. Do that. Julian worked the money. He was more efficient with it. Through 2 intermediary holding companies, he began quietly acquiring the outstanding debt on Silas Thorne's primary business entity, Thorne Capital Consulting, which had been carrying significant leverage debt for 3 years and whose creditors were, Julian's analyst confirmed, becoming impatient. He bought the debt at a slight premium, quietly, without triggering any notification that would alert Silas to what was happening. Then he called his contacts at 3 of the 4 banks that provided Thorne Capital's operational credit lines and had conversations that were, in the careful language of finance, merely informational. Observations about the risk profile of certain clients. The kind of conversations that did not technically constitute interference, but that nonetheless resulted, within a week, in 2 of those banks declining to renew Thorne Capital's revolving credit facility. He did all of this from his office, in meetings that looked like any other meetings, in language that meant nothing to anyone who did not know what it meant. He was very good at this. He had been doing it, in one form or another, since he was 23 years old. In the evenings, he went home. This was the part that surprised him most, that he went home. In the 5 years he had lived in the penthouse, it had been a place he kept his clothes and occasionally slept. He had worked routinely until 10 or 11 at night, eaten takeout at his desk, conducted calls until midnight. The apartment had been clean and perfect and completely without the quality of being lived in. Now, when he stepped off the elevator in the evenings, there were shoes by the door, small ones, often arranged in a crooked line as if someone had made a sincere effort at neatness without quite achieving it. There was a drawing on the kitchen refrigerator, held up with a magnet that had come from somewhere, a child's drawing of 3 figures, the tallest one with dark spiky hair, the middle one with what appeared to be a yellow cape, Clara's yellow coat, Julian realized, and the smallest one in the middle holding both their hands. He stood in front of it for almost 2 minutes the first time he saw it. 3 weeks after Alara came to live in the Vance Tower, Silas Thorne was desperate. The credit facility rejections had been a shock. 2 major clients had quietly not renewed their consulting contracts. A joint venture he had been depending on for cash flow had stalled at the due diligence stage when the partner firm's analyst flagged a pattern of unusual financial discrepancies in Thorne Capital's books. The same discrepancies, though Silas did not know this, that Gerald Park had been cataloging in his report for Clara Hayes. Silas was a man who had operated for years in the comfortable middle distance between legitimacy and fraud, close enough to the legitimate to maintain the appearance, far enough into fraud to actually profit. The system worked when no one was looking closely. When someone began looking closely, it unraveled very quickly. He needed capital, and he needed it from someone who had too much of it to care about the details. His financial advisor brought him a name, Falcon Ridge Ventures, a private equity firm that had been making strategic investments in distressed consulting businesses. The managing partner had expressed interest in Thorne Capital. A meeting had been arranged. Silas walked into the conference room of the Falcon Ridge offices on the 41st floor of a midtown tower wearing his best suit and his most confident expression and stopped walking when he saw who was sitting at the head of the table. Julian Vance looked back at him. "Mr. Thorne," Julian said. "Sit down." Silas sat. Some part of him, the surviving animal instinct of a man who had spent a career reading rooms, registered that something was wrong. But the desperation was louder than the instinct. "I wasn't aware that you were connected to Falcon Ridge," Silas said carefully. "I'm connected to most things," Julian said. He did not smile. He opened the folder in front of him with the same unhurried precision he brought to every meeting, though this was not like every meeting. This meeting had been constructed the way a surgeon constructs an incision, exact, deliberate, and designed to reach something specific. Tell me about your current portfolio. And Silas told him. He talked for 40 minutes, and Julian listened with the patient, focused attention of a man who was genuinely considering an investment, which, Silas slowly convinced himself, was exactly what he was. By the time Silas had reached the part about Thorn Capital's exciting growth trajectory in the ESG consulting space, he had talked himself into believing that this was a real meeting, that the money was real, that he was going to be all right. There's one thing I want to understand, Julian said, at the 41-minute mark. Your personal liquidity situation. I'm seeing some irregular cash flows in the financials your assistant sent over. Silas shifted slightly. Family Trust Administration. It's complicated but entirely compliant. Whose trust? A beat. A family member. A minor. I'm the legal guardian. I see. Julian made a note on his legal pad. And the minor? Is she well? Healthy? Happy? Something in Silas's face flickered. Perfectly, he said, perfectly well. Julian looked up from his legal pad, and for the first time in the meeting, his expression changed. It didn't become angry. It became something quieter and more dangerous than anger. Absolute, certain contempt. Mr. Thorne, he said, Alara Sterling is currently living in my home. The silence that followed was the kind that has physical weight. She has been examined by my personal physician, Julian continued, his voice perfectly even. His report documents a cigarette burn, belt marks, and a pattern of physical abuse spanning the 8 months she was in your custody. That report is currently in the possession of Clara Hayes, who is preparing a case file for the Manhattan Family Court that includes the medical documentation, witness statements, and the full financial audit of the Sterling Trust that my forensic accountant has completed. Mr. Park estimates the unauthorized distributions at approximately $480,000, though he says he may find more. Silas had gone gray. His voice had lost all its shape. I don't know what I'm not here to negotiate with you, Julian said. I'm here to tell you what is going to happen. You are going to appear in family court on the date that Clara Hayes has set, and you are going to lose. You are going to lose custody permanently, and you are going to face criminal charges for child abuse and the fraudulent administration of a trust. And Thorn Capital Consulting, he closed the folder, will cease to exist as a functional business entity within approximately 60 days, because I own your debt, and I will be calling it. Silas stared at him. His face had gone from gray to a deep, mottled red. You can't. You have no right. She is my family. She is a child, Julian said. And for the first time, there was something in his voice that was not controlled. Something that had come from a parking garage on West 34th Street and a grocery bag over small cold feet. And you heard her. And there is nothing on this earth you have that is adequate compensation for that. But I am going to take everything anyway. He stood. The meeting is over, Mr. Thorne. Enjoy the elevator. The hearing was on a Tuesday in November, in a courtroom that was smaller than Clara would have liked. Family court had a way of making consequential things feel procedural. But what it lacked in grandeur it made up for in the focused attention of Judge Marian Okafor, who was 61 years old, had been on the family court bench for 19 years, and had seen everything. She had also, Clara knew from research, presided over 14 adoption hearings in the previous year with a strong record for children's best interests, and had zero tolerance for attorneys who wasted her time. Silas had hired Theodore Brackett, who was expensive and had a reputation for aggressive procedural maneuvering. He arrived with 2 associates and a stack of filings that were designed to make Clara's case look complicated. Clara arrived with Gerald Park, Dr. Hargrove, and a USB drive. She let Brackett go first. His opening argument was a well-crafted performance. Silas as the devoted, grieving guardian. His home a refuge of stability for a traumatized child. The allegations of abuse the product of a corporate billionaire's unilateral and legally questionable decision to retain a child who had come to him under unclear circumstances. He suggested, with the careful vagueness of an attorney who knows what he cannot prove, that Julian's interest in Alara was itself worth examining. Judge Okafor's expression did not change throughout this argument. Clara had learned to read that particular stillness. Then Clara stood up. Your Honor, she said, I'm going to keep this simple. Because the evidence is simple. In the 8 months that Alara Sterling was in the legal guardianship of Silas and Beatrice Thorne, she sustained injuries documented in 4 separate emergency room visits. I'd like to enter those records as Exhibits A through D. She walked the judge through each record with calm, unhurried precision. The before and after photographs. Alara, at age 7, in a photograph from her parents' files, round-cheeked and grinning at a birthday party, and the intake photographs from Dr. Hargrove's examination were Exhibit A. She heard Silas's sharp intake of breath when those went up. Gerald Park took the stand and spent 25 minutes explaining, with the promised whiteboard clarity, the trail of unauthorized trust fund distributions. He had found, in total, $530,000 in transfers. The audience in the courtroom, sparse but attentive, was very quiet. Then Clara played the recording. She had not told Brackett about the recording. She had obtained it through a process she was not going to describe in open court, but which was entirely legal. It had been made by the emergency room nurse at Alara's 3rd visit, a woman named Joy, who had suspected abuse and turned on the voice memo app on her personal phone when Silas came in and began speaking to the trio of staff. A recording she had preserved and provided to Clara with the assistance of the hospital's patient advocate that on the recording, Silas's voice was calm and deliberate. As he told the nurse that Alara had fallen down the stairs, that she was a very clumsy child, that he had told her repeatedly to be careful, that he and his wife were at their wits' end with her honestly, that she just never listened. In the background of the recording, barely audible, was the sound of a child crying. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Brackett objected on 6 grounds in rapid succession. Judge Okafor overruled 5 of them and asked clarifying questions on the 6th before overruling that one too. Clara looked at Silas. He had the look of a man watching the floor give way beneath him. The slow, terrible comprehension of someone who had believed, with the confidence of the habitually unchallenged, that he was untouchable. Your Honor, Clara said, the evidence establishes a pattern of deliberate physical abuse, the fraudulent misappropriation of a minor's trust estate, and a complete failure of the duty of care owed by a legal guardian. We request the immediate and permanent termination of Silas Thorne's guardianship, the appointment of an independent trustee for the Sterling estate, and the referral of this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. She sat down. Brackett rose for his cross-examination of Dr. Hargrove, and it lasted 12 minutes before the doctor's calm, systematic answers, honed by 30 years of providing medical testimony, had reduced Brackett's argument to a series of technical objections that satisfied no one, including, visibly, Brackett himself. Silas took the stand, and within 20 minutes, under Clara's cross-examination, he had made 3 contradictory statements about the origin of Alara's burn injury, had been unable to explain 2 of the 4 ER visits in terms consistent with the medical records, and had, when Clara pressed him, quietly and precisely, on the question of why he had told the ER nurse that Alara was at his wits' end, said, in a voice that had lost all its professional composure, because she was a difficult child. She was demanding and ungrateful, and she never. He stopped. The courtroom was very quiet. Never what, Mr. Thorne? Clara asked that he looked at his lawyer, then at the judge. Then, for the first time since the hearing began, at Julian, who was sitting in the gallery in a dark suit with his hands folded in his lap and his face wearing an expression of absolute, patient certainty. Silas said nothing further. Judge Okafor's ruling took 45 minutes to deliver and was comprehensive. Silas Thorne's guardianship was terminated immediately. The Sterling Trust was placed under the administration of an independent trustee appointed by the court pending investigation. The matter was formally referred to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office with the full evidence package for criminal investigation of both child abuse and financial fraud charges. Beatrice Thorne, who had been sitting in the gallery with the expression of a woman who had spent 48 years being protected by her husband's confidence and was only now beginning to understand that this would not continue, was named specifically in the abuse findings. The DA's office had, in fact, been expecting the referral. Clara had spoken to the deputy DA handling child welfare cases 3 days earlier. The arrest warrants had been prepared. 2 officers were waiting in the corridor outside the courtroom. Clara watched Silas's face when he saw them, watched the performance finally, completely collapse, the worried uncle and the concerned guardian and the aggrieved defendant dissolving simultaneously into something much simpler. A frightened man who had believed himself safe and was no longer. Silas Thorne, the officer said, "You are under arrest for child abuse in the second degree and fraudulent breach of fiduciary duty." Beatrice, when they came to her, did not even try to perform. She went pale and still and said nothing, and they put the handcuffs on her with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Julian received a text from his CFO at 11:47 a.m. as the Thornes were being led out of the courthouse. Thorne Capital Debt called. Legal process initiated. Estimated asset liquidation insufficient to cover outstanding liability. Company effectively insolvent. He read it, put his phone in his pocket, and went to find Clara. She was in the corridor, talking to the DA's representative, and when she saw him, she finished the conversation and walked over. She looked, he noticed, like someone who had been holding something very tightly for several weeks and had just, in the last hour, been allowed to set it down. There were circles under her eyes, and her yellow coat had a coffee stain on the sleeve that she hadn't had time to deal with. And she was, Julian thought, one of the most impressive people he had encountered in a life that had contained a significant number of impressive people. The ruling, he said. Comprehensive, she agreed. Thorne Capital is insolvent as of this morning. She nodded. A pause. How is Alara? Mrs. Aldridge is with her. She doesn't know yet. He paused. I'm going to tell her tonight. Tell her what? He met Clara's eyes. That it's over. That she doesn't have to be afraid anymore. Another pause. And that I'm starting the formal adoption process, if you'll help me with the paperwork. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she held out her hand if he shook it. And then, because the moment seemed to require something more than a handshake, neither of them quite ended it immediately, and they stood there in the corridor of the family court building with the sound of the city coming through the windows, holding on a moment longer than was strictly professional. The paperwork, she said finally. The paperwork, he agreed. December in New York was cold and brilliant, and Alara Sterling was learning to run, not from anything, toward things, toward the kitchen when Mrs. Aldridge made her hot chocolate, toward Julian's study door when she heard him finish a phone call, toward the snow that had appeared one morning on the terrace like a personal gift, pressing her face against the glass with her breath, making small fog circles before Julian opened the door and let her out in her new boots and new coat to stand in 3 inches of it with her arms spread wide. Clara, who had come to drop off paperwork and stayed for 2 hours, watched from the doorway as Alara turned in slow circles in the snow on the 42nd floor terrace, her face turned up to the sky, laughing with the completely uninhibited, unself-conscious laughter of a child who had finally, cautiously, begun to trust that joy was not something that would be taken away. She broke a glass last week, Julian said, beside her in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee. Clara took one. What happened? She froze. Went completely still, started apologizing before I even turned around. He paused. I sat on the kitchen floor with her and told her that I break things all the time, and then I dropped another glass on purpose to demonstrate. Clara looked at him. You broke a glass on purpose. A cheap one. I checked first. He was quiet for a moment, watching Alara in the snow. It took her about 30 seconds to start laughing. Clara watched the small figure turning in circles and thought about the girl who had arrived here barely able to eat without hoarding the food in her pockets. A behavior Mrs. Aldridge had noticed and handled with such gentle tact, simply leaving a small basket of crackers and fruit in Alara's room and explaining that it was always there, always full, always hers, and about all the space between that girl and this one, and the fact that the space had been crossed not with grand gestures, but with broken glasses and crackers and bedside lamps left on through thunderstorms. The adoption hearing was set for the 3rd week of January. Clara had prepared the case with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and she had also been completely honest with Julian about the challenges. A single male adoptive parent, no prior parenting history, a compressed timeline. She had spent weeks building the file, home study reports, character references, financial assessments, the testimony of Dr. Hargrove and the child psychologist Dr. Reyes, who had been seeing Alara twice a week and whose report described, with clinical precision, the observable improvement in her anxiety, her attachment behavior, and her capacity for trust. Dr. Reyes had said. In a session summary she had shared with Clara, Alara demonstrates a secure primary attachment to her prospective adoptive father that is clinically significant and appears to be the primary driver of her recovery. In my assessment, permanency in this placement is strongly indicated for her continued well-being. Clara had read that summary 3 times. She had also, and she would not have admitted this in a professional context, spent more evenings in the penthouse than were strictly required by the case. She had eaten dinner there more often than not, initially because there were always things to discuss and it was efficient, and then gradually because it had become something that she looked forward to in a way that was harder to categorize as purely professional. Alara had started sitting next to her on the couch while Clara worked, not necessarily speaking, just being nearby, which Clara had learned was Alara's particular version of affection. Proximity is trust, Julian had noticed. He was a man who noticed everything, which was one of the qualities that made him extraordinary at what he did and occasionally slightly unnerving in a social context. But he had not made anything of it, had not pushed or commented, had simply continued to make 2 mugs of coffee when Clara arrived, and one evening, without asking, had put her yellow coat on the hook by the door next to Alara's pink one, a small, entirely unnecessary act of placement that Clara had stood and looked at for an embarrassingly long time. "Julian," she said now, standing in the doorway with their coffee while Alara threw snow at a potted tree. "Clara, I want to be at the adoption hearing, not as your attorney." He was quiet. She felt him look at her sideways. "In what capacity?" he asked, as she stopped. Outside, Alara had discovered that snow thrown at a metal railing made a particular satisfying sound, and was now doing it repeatedly with the focused commitment of a scientist confirming a hypothesis. As someone who wants to see it happen, personally, Julian was quiet for a moment longer. "There's paperwork," he said eventually, and his voice was dry and warm and entirely unlike the voice she had first heard on the phone at midnight. "I'm a lawyer," she said. "I'm not afraid of paperwork." On the first Saturday of March, the weather was extraordinary, the kind of day that Manhattan produced occasionally in early spring as though apologizing for winter. Clear sky, 62 degrees, a light wind that came off the park smelling of turned earth and possibility. The trees in Central Park were still bare, but there was a shimmer of green at the end of every branch, the hesitant, preliminary green of things that had survived the cold and were starting to believe in warmth again. Julian had carried the blanket. Clara had carried the basket. Alara had carried her bear, whose missing glass eye had been replaced in January. Julian had spent 45 minutes in a craft store in the East Village selecting the right size and color, accompanied by a highly entertained Clara, and who now regarded the world from Alara's arms with a pleasingly lopsided dignity. They settled in the sheep meadow, which was beginning to accumulate other families, other clusters of people in light jackets, eating sandwiches and throwing frisbees and existing in the particular, unself-conscious contentment of people who have enough. Alara ate half a sandwich and 2 clementines and then lay on her back in the grass with her bear on her chest and watched the sky. "There are exactly 43 clouds," she announced after a while. "I count 44, Julian said, shielding his eyes. "The one by the left is 2 clouds that are touching. They count separately." "An arguable position," Clara said. "It's not a position, it's a fact." Julian made a face that was, Clara observed, his suppressed smile face, which she had become quite good at identifying over the past several months. He was different in the park, not less himself. If anything, more himself, the version of himself that existed when no one who needed to be impressed was watching. Alara sat up abruptly and looked at them with the directness that had never left her, the quality of someone who had learned to ask the important questions before the conversation moved on. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," Clara said. Alara looked at Julian, then at Clara, then back at Julian. "Are you going to keep me forever?" she asked. "Like, actually forever?" "Not until something changes or you get tired of me or you decide that." She stopped, looked at her bear, the familiar line of her shoulders, the careful bracing against a possible answer. Clara felt something move behind her sternum. Julian reached over and took Alara's hand. This had taken months, the arriving at an ease with physical affection, the gradual dismantling of the flinch, and it was not yet complete. But in this moment Alara did not flinch. She held on. And Julian looked at her with the most unguarded expression Clara had ever seen on his face. "Alara," he said, "I kept you from the moment you were under my car in the rain. I'm not going to stop." Alara's chin was trembling. "But what if?" she started. "There is no what if," he said. "There are no conditions." She looked at Clara. Clara reached over and took Alara's other hand. The three of them sat in the grass in the March sunlight, connected. "You know what I told you," Clara said, "that day in the kitchen? About what lawyers do. Use rules to protect people," Alara said. "Right. And I made you a promise that day, even though I didn't say it out loud. I promised that I was going to protect you. That's not a legal agreement. That doesn't expire." She paused. "And everything that's happened since. This isn't a case anymore, Alara. This is my life. You are my life. Both of you." She looked at Julian very briefly when she said the last part, and he looked back, and the communication between them in that look was the kind that does not require words. Alara looked between them. "So you both want me," she said. Not quite a question. Something that was beginning, cautiously, to be a statement. "We do," Julian said. "We do," Clara said. "Forever." The word landed in the bright March air and sat there. Forever. The most enormous and the most ordinary word. The one that children need most and are given least. And Alara Sterling turned it over in her mind with the careful, wondering attention of someone who has been handed something precious and is not yet sure it's real. And then she lay back down in the grass between them, her bear on her chest, and looked at her 43 clouds. And after a moment Julian lay back too on one side of her, and Clara on the other, and the three of them were quiet for a while, listening to the sounds of the park, voices and dogs, and the distant percussion of someone learning to skateboard, and the particular, unremarkable, extraordinary sound of ordinary life continuing. Later, Alara fell asleep between them with the unconscious trust of a child who knows she is safe. One hand loosely tangled in Julian's, and one resting on Clara's arm. Julian and Clara looked at each other across the sleeping girl that he reached across and tucked a strand of hair behind Clara's ear, a gesture so simple and unhurried that it said everything the two of them had been not quite saying for months. She smiled. He smiled back. It was the kind of smile that he didn't give very often, not the controlled expression of a man in a boardroom, but something younger and more unguarded, something that had been waiting, perhaps, since a parking garage on West 34th Street, for the right combination of people to draw it out. Somewhere above them, 43, or possibly 44. Clouds moved slowly across the sky. The city went on around them, enormous and indifferent and full of strangers. But here, in this particular corner of the world, in the warm grass of a March afternoon, there was a man who had once slept in a parking garage, and a woman who had learned to fight for the defenseless, and a child who had once crouched under a car in the rain and whispered that nobody wanted her. And they were, all three of them, exactly where they needed to be. "Nobody wants me," she had whispered, in the rain, in the dark, believing every word of it. "We do," they would tell her 100 times, 1,000 times, in 100 ordinary moments of grass and hot chocolate and broken glasses and clouds. "We do. Forever." And they meant it.